When Clint Eastwood enters the Steve Harvey Show, the mood is light. The audience expects a few smiles, some anecdotes from filming, and that funny yet sincere tone that Steve wields to perfection. But as soon as Clint takes his seat and looks at the cross hanging around Steve's neck, something changes. The air, the tone, the very purpose of this interview. What was meant to be a televised moment becomes something else, something deeper. In the minutes that follow, it won't be Steve asking the questions. He'll be the one trying to hold back the tears. And it all starts with a sentence no one expected. Can I tell you something I've never told anyone before? The studio lights dim slightly as the audience quiets down. A gentle tension settles in, almost sacred. Steve Harvey's theme music fades out as the host crosses the stage with that iconic half smile, index cards in hand, eyes filled with warmth. But tonight is different. Steve feels it from the very first seconds. This isn't a show, it's a confession. With a voice full of respect, he introduces his guest. He's not just a film legend. He's a soul, a man people feel, even if they've never met him. The audience applauds wildly as Clint Eastwood enters, dressed simply. Dark jeans, black shirt, unpretentious jacket. Nothing flashy, just him. He greets briefly, flashes a discreet smile, and nods as he takes a seat. The attention obviously makes him uncomfortable. But here he is, and as soon as he settles in, the mood changes again. Less show, more truth. He speaks in a calm, low voice, almost as if he didn't want to disturb the silence. He thanks the audience, then, half smiling, admits that this kind of welcome always catches him off guard. "I'm just a guy doing his best." Steve bows to him, smiling. "That's what it makes you the special." They don't really talk about movies or gossip. They're talking about humanity, about kindness, about what it means to go through life unarmored. Even when the world gives you 1,000 reasons why. Steve brings up the stories we know about Clint, his discreet gestures, his humility, his respect for those around him on set. Clint nods without making a big deal of it. It's not a big deal, it's just the right thing to do. He speaks with the quiet wisdom of a man who has lived, never trying to impress. The audience hangs on his every word. "Everyone's going through something," he adds. "Sometimes a small gesture is enough to change a whole day." Steve nods, touched. It's heartbreaking to hear this from a man who would have had every reason to hide behind his celebrity and who instead chooses the naked truth. Then the conversation shifts to the question on everyone's mind. How can such a famous man remain so humble? Clint looks down slightly. "None of this is guaranteed," he says. "I've lost a lot. When you lose the ones you love, when life hits you hard, you quickly understand that all of it, doesn't make you better than anyone else." Silence. His gaze loses itself for a moment, perhaps in a memory. "I grew up moving all the time. Born in San Francisco, raised between dust and discipline. My father wasn't always there. My sister was often sick. I lost people I loved. And yet, I'm still here. Every day, it's a choice. You let the pain harden you, or you let it make you a softer person." These words fall like a sacred weight in the studio. You could hear a pin drop. The audience holds its breath. Steve, moved, instinctively reaches for the cross around his neck. He says nothing, not yet. He simply holds it, as if acknowledging something only he can understand. "You speak of silence as if it were an old friend," he finally says. Clint nods. "It is. Silence has kept me company for a long time, and sometimes in that silence, I hear the clearest things." Steve straightens slightly, his voice softer. "And have you ever heard God in that silence?" For the first time, Clint really stops. He slowly raises his eyes to Steve's and looks straight into his own. "I believe it. I believe it. I doubted. I've run away. I've been alone. But even in the darkest night, there was something, a presence, a peace. Not always strong, not always gentle, but always there." Steve clutches his cross in his hand. That's faith, even if it doesn't have a name, even if it's just something you feel. Clint looks at the cross, his expression changing. He leans in a little, almost hesitantly, as if he's about to cross a threshold. Steve, he says, his voice deep, lower, as if charged with something profound. Can I tell you something I've never said out loud before? Steve doesn't answer. He nods. Clint takes a long breath. There was a night, a few years ago, I was in the dark. Total darkness. I couldn't move, couldn't eat, I couldn't sleep. I didn't even know if I wanted to go on living. Everything seemed empty. The studio froze when I was scrolling through my phone just to escape my thoughts. Then I came across a video. It was you. You were talking about the meaning of life, about faith, about how God doesn't waste pain. Steve's not moving. It wasn't just what you said, it was how you said it. Like you'd lived it, and you wore that cross. Exactly this one. And I thought, this man believes in something bigger. Maybe I can too. Steve looks slowly at his cross, his hand tightens around it. I watched that clip 3 times, Clint murmurs. And the next day, for the first time in weeks, I got up. He leans back as if the memory weighs on him. I've never told anyone this, but your words, I've kept them with me ever since that day. Steve remains silent for a long moment. Then his voice breaks. I was just speaking from the heart. I had no idea. Clint gently interrupts. That's just it. You didn't know. You weren't trying to inspire me. You were just you, and that saved me. Steve's eyes are shining now. A tear slides down, reflecting the studio lights. And that cross you wear, says Clint respectfully, it's not just a symbol, it's a sign, it's a message. You think you're just an actor with faith. But Steve, I think you're something else. Steve frowns, surprised but receptive. I think you're a preacher who doesn't know himself. Clint leans in again. And I still have something to tell you, something that could change your life, just as you've changed mine. A sacred silence falls over the studio. Even the camera seems suspended. Steve, still with his hand on his cross, murmurs, I'm listening. It was no longer a show. There was no more laughter, no more scripted breaks. There was something else. A presence, a naked truth that had just made its entrance. Clint Eastwood leaned toward Steve Harvey, his eyes sincere, his voice low but firm. Can I tell you something I've never revealed in public? Steve, surprised but attentive, had simply given him space. Clint had settled back into his chair, like a man ready to open a door long since closed. The audience was still. No murmurs, no commotion, just undivided human attention. Clint inhaled slowly. His gaze never left Steve, but what he saw seemed far, far away. There was a time in my life, he began, where I couldn't find a reason to get up in the morning. Steve didn't flinch, but his body froze as if his soul had stepped forward to listen. I've lost people, Clint continued. Not just through death, through time, through pain, one by one. His voice remained calm, but each word sounded like it had been torn from an old scar. My daughter was born lifeless, he said softly. And a few weeks later, I lost Jennifer. She was my home. He paused, lowered his eyes to his hands. I don't think I cried right away. Grief isn't always loud. Sometimes it's so silent, you forget you're alive. The audience remained suspended. Some leaned forward, others inward. I kept working, he says, doing interviews, playing roles, because it's easier to hide behind a character than to be yourself when yourself is broken. Steve touched the cross around his neck again. Not for the camera, just a reflex, just support. But one day, continued Clint, the silence was stronger than anything else. And that night, it almost won. Steve tilted his head. His eyes searched Clint's face for something. It was late, said Clint. I was on my own. I hadn't slept in days. I hadn't eaten. I hadn't spoken. I was just there, in the dark, sitting hours. Long silence. No prayers, no thoughts, just this emptiness. After all the thoughts. Then a tiny change in his voice. And then it happened. I picked up my phone, I scrolled, without looking, just so I wouldn't feel. He inhaled slowly, and I came across a video. It was you. Steve blinked in surprise. You were on stage, you were talking about storms. You were saying that God doesn't waste pain, That sometimes what breaks us is what opens us. Steve nodded slowly. He remembered. I don't know why I stopped at that video, Clint admitted, but I watched it all the way through. And then again, his voice barely broke. You said, if you're still breathing, God isn't finished with you yet. And for some reason, those words changed everything. It was as if, for once, someone saw me. Not the actor, not the name in the papers, just the man in the dark. Steve breathed softly. His hand came to rest entirely on the cross. Clint leaned over, elbows on knees, voice barely a whisper. And I need you to know something, Steve. That night I got up. He let the silence settle. Not because I was cured, not because I'd found answers, but because, for the first time in a long time, I felt seen. And that was enough to take a step. These words struck Steve right in the heart. His eyes were wet, his lips trembled slightly. Clint looked at him with deep gratitude. I'd never planned to tell anyone this, but looking at you tonight, I know I had to. Steve's voice came out slowly, laden with emotion. Man, I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, Clint replied. You've already said it. You said it years ago. He pointed to the cross on Steve's chest. That's what caught my eye. Before the words, before the message. That symbol, that night, it was a beacon. Steve looked down again. His hand tightened on the cross. I kept listening to your message the next few days, Clint said. Not because it fixed me, but because it reminded me that we don't need answers to heal. Just a little hope. The audience remained silent. Some wept softly, others motionless. Steve leaned against the backrest, swallowing hard. You think all you do is talk, said Clint. You think you're entertaining, that you're keeping up. But that night you carried someone who no longer had the strength to stand. Steve closed his eyes for a moment, letting the words sink in. I had to tell you, continued Clint, because the world knows you as an entertainer, a comedian, a motivator. But I don't think that's the whole truth. Steve looked at him, still in shock. I think you're a preacher in disguise. A long silence followed. Steve's eyes filled again. He shook his head gently, not to deny it, but as if it were too much to take in all at once. Do you ever wonder why people are attracted to you? Asked Clint. All the time, Steve admitted. Clint smiled slightly. It's because they don't just listen to your voice, they feel your spirit. You're carrying something sacred, man. Steve let out a small, broken laugh. I'm just doing my best like everybody else. And that's what makes it real, Clint had said. You're not trying to be anyone else, and that's why you touch people you'll never meet. He looked toward the audience. People in rooms like this, behind screens, in silence, like me that night. Then he turned back to Steve. And I know it's heavy sometimes, carrying all this around, not knowing if it really matters. Steve nodded slowly, touched. But I'm here to tell you, said Clint, it does matter. And just as the emotion reached its peak, Clint leaned in, his voice lower, more poised, but full of intent. Steve, the way you wear that cross, it's not just a symbol, it's a message, and tonight I have something to tell you. Something that could change your life, like you've changed mine. Steve looked up in surprise. The audience leaned in, sensing the moment. What do you mean? Asked Steve softly. Clint didn't blink. These words, I've been wearing them for years. They come from you. And tonight, I have to say them again. Steve remained motionless, his breathing jerky. Clint nodded once. Because I think you've forgotten how powerful they are. The silence was denser than ever. Steve Harvey froze, his eyes fixed on Clint Eastwood, listening to the man repeat the words that had saved him. Words he'd spoken without knowing, and which he would now receive, like a sacred echo. The studio was plunged into total silence. Even the usual hum of the cameras seemed to have fallen silent. Clint Eastwood sat up slowly, inhaling deeply, like a man about to revisit a sacred memory. I remember that video, he said at last. The light wasn't ideal, a little blurry. You were on stage, microphone in one hand, the other resting there, on your chest, on that cross. Steve nodded slowly, already overwhelmed by what was rising up inside him. You were talking about purpose, continued Clint, but not as someone who's been rehearsing. You were struggling with your story as you shared it. He paused, staring into Steve's eyes. And then you said something I've never forgotten. God doesn't always choose the most capable. He enables those he chooses. Steve's lips barely parted. His hand returned instinctively to his cross. You also said that God uses ordinary people to do extraordinary things, Clint added. Even if you think you're just making jokes, paying your bills, lasting until tomorrow, God can use that to change someone's life. Steve leaned back, elbows on knees. He was seeing that video again, the one he'd recorded without a script, after a difficult night, just talking with his soul. And that day I understood something, said Clint. It wasn't just what you said, it was how you said it. You believed it. And that belief, it ignited something in me. He looked down for a moment. I'd lost my way. The grief, the silence. They'd buried my compass. But when I heard those words and saw how you wore them, I understood that even at my lowest ebb, I wasn't invisible. He looked up. You were a stranger to me, but that night you became a beacon. Steve let out a long breath as if it carried years of weight. Clint smiled gently. That's right, a lighthouse. You never know who's watching. It shines, that's all there is to it. There was a long silence, full, loaded with all that had been said and all that was yet to be said. Then Steve spoke, his voice lower. You know, sometimes I wonder if I've done enough. If Rawamas, the humor, the shows, the speeches, if it's really served any purpose. Clint leaned forward a little. It did. I'm living proof. Steve shook his head, overcome by emotion. I was just trying to survive, man, not save anyone. And that's exactly why you did it. The audience barely stirred. A few tears were discreetly wiped away. Others remained frozen in a kind of contemplation. Steve looked at the crowd, then at Clint. You say this video changed something in you. What did it change? Clint thought for a moment, then answered, hope. Maybe silence wasn't the end of my story. Maybe, yes, God still had something for me. He looked Steve straight in the eye. And when I saw that cross on your chest, while you were talking about purpose and faith, it wasn't a coincidence. It was confirmation that the light shines through, even through a screen. Steve nodded slowly, deeply touched. You reminded me that I wasn't forgotten, that my story wasn't over. He let the silence breathe. And I remember exactly what you said. Word for word, I've carried it with me for years. And tonight I have to say it again, because I think you've forgotten how powerful it was. Steve looked at him, a question in his eyes. Clint inhaled deeply, his gaze anchored. Sometimes you're not the one being saved. You're the one who's saved, and you don't even know it. Steve's lips trembled. You think you're speaking the truth, but in reality you're testifying. Clint leaned back, letting the words sink in. Steve brought his hands to his face for a moment, then raised his head, his eyes shining. You remember all this? I had to, said Clint, because I wasn't just listening to you. I was getting up because of you. Steve stepped back, hands clasped, as if not to collapse. The room seemed to have changed. It was no longer a TV set. It was a place of healing. Clint's voice returned, softer than ever. Maybe we don't tell you this enough, but Steve, you matter, not for what you do, for who you are. You've brought faith to places where there was none left, including me. Steve didn't answer right away. He breathed slowly, deeply. Then Clint added, almost in a whisper, and tonight I have something to tell you, something that could change your life, like you've changed mine. Steve looked up. The whole studio held its breath. He said nothing. He was absorbing everything Clint had just offered him. Recognition, testimony, truth. Clint leaned in again, this time with a different presence. What he was about to say no longer came from a memory, but from something sacred. I remember every word you said, he said, and tonight I want to say them again. Not as a reminder, like a mirror. Steve stared at him without moving, and Clint, calmly and reverently, began to recite. God doesn't always use the strong or the perfect. Sometimes he chooses the broken, the ones you don't expect, because they know how to reach the ones the strong can't. Steve blinked slowly. The words flowed through him like a tide he could no longer resist. You don't need a pulpit to preach. You don't need a robe to be called. You don't need a church to carry the word. Clint wasn't shaking. He wasn't reciting a video. He was delivering a message. Sometimes your pain is your ministry, and sometimes your humor. It's just the costume God uses to bring hope. Steve opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He was overwhelmed. Clint looked at him tenderly, as if he were giving not a compliment, but a revelation. You thought you were just making people laugh, but you did so much more than that. You touched hearts. You were saving lives. You carried the light. He let those words sink in, then added the phrase that broke down Steve's last defenses. You're a pastor, Steve. You're just wearing a suit instead of a white collar. Steve lowered his head, one hand on his face, the other clutched his cross. Tears flowed freely, unashamedly, without restraint. And in the studio, no noise, no music, no applause, just silence, sacred, living, holy. Clint took a long breath. Then, in a deep, unaffected voice, he said, I've had a phrase inside me for years, never uttered aloud. Until now. Steve nodded slowly, his eyes searching Clint's. Go ahead, he murmured. Clint leaned in. No performance, just the naked truth. God uses those he chooses, he said, even when they think they're just telling jokes. Steve blinked. He didn't move. Clint continued slowly, each word like a nail in the silence. You thought you were entertaining. You thought you were making people laugh. But Steve, you were saving lives. A tear rolled down Steve's cheek. Not one of pain, one of understanding. Clint nodded gently, his gaze saying it all. It's true, you saved mine. For a moment, no one breathed. Even the cameras seemed to bow. Steve stepped back. A breath escaped him. A mixture of laughter, tears, disbelief. I was just doing my best, man. We all were. Clint nodded. That's exactly why. It was sacred. The words hung in the air. Then something happened. Steve stood up. His body trembled, not from weakness, but from something greater, something sacred. He didn't speak. He touched the cross around his neck and looked at Clint. Clint rose to his feet, face to face, two men standing. Time stood still. Steve asked a question, not born of doubt, but from a visceral need to understand. Why me, why? Clint didn't answer immediately. He let the air absorb the question. Then calmly, I'll tell you, he didn't hurry his words. He let them come as if heaven itself were listening. God chooses the unlikely, the forgotten ones, those who bleed silently behind the curtain. He chooses those who have suffered, because they know how to speak to those who suffer. Steve didn't move. His eyes shone with something older than tears. Clint continued, You're not the loudest, you're not the smoothest. You haven't studied theology. You don't know the whole Bible. But God has seen your scars, and he trusted you with a microphone. Even so. And then, in the heart of that calm storm, Steve whispered, But why me? Of all the people he could have chosen, why me? Clint approached again, right in front of him. I'll tell you why. The audience didn't move. Some were crying, others held hands. No one touched their phone. No one wanted to escape the moment. Steve breathed, his voice broken but firm. I thought about quitting, leaving the light, giving up. Clint nodded as if he already knew. Me too, he replied. More than once, they sat down again, not because the moment had passed, but because it had reached its depth. Steve leaned back, his eyes lost somewhere far away. I've asked God more than once, what do you want from me? Sometimes I don't feel pure enough, stable enough to talk about faith. Clint nodded gently, and that's precisely why he chose you. Steve looked at him, surprised. Your voice doesn't sound like a preacher. It sounds like a man who's lived, who's lost, who has cried in the dark. There was no applause, no music, just a presence. Steve stared at Clint, this time with a new intensity. Do you really think we can still have faith in a world like this? The question hung in the air, heavy, eternal. And the way Clint looked at him, calm, sure, almost luminous, made everyone realize that what he was about to say would never be forgotten. He took his time. The words came from afar. I believe that faith is the only thing that doesn't pretend. Steve inclined his head. He was listening. In Hollywood, everything's scripted, said Clint. You rehearse the pain. We play joy. But faith, it has no director. It demands truth. It demands surrender. He leaned in slightly, his voice softer but stronger. Faith doesn't get headlines, doesn't win awards. It doesn't get invited to parties. But it saves, silently, deeply, forever. Steve nodded slowly. His throat tightened. Movies teach you to act, Clint said. Faith teaches you to live. A shiver went through the audience. Not a sound, just a change in energy. Faith is the only way. No spotlight, no camera, no applause. Just you and God. Steve said nothing. He put his hand on his heart and nodded, overwhelmed. Clint looked at Steve, his eyes full of something eternal. I didn't grow up with religion, but I've come to believe that faith is real. Not because it was preached to me, because it found me. In the silence, when the lights were out and no one was there, he looked at Steve, his voice vibrating. And she found me through you. Steve looked at him, trembling. Not the televised Steve Harvey, the real one. The one with the cross. The one who'd had the courage to talk to a stranger through a screen. Clint stood up, and after a second, Steve stood up too. They stared at each other for a long time. Two men, two lives marked by pain, connected by grace. Clint opened his arms. Steve stepped forward, without hesitation. They embraced, not as host and guest, but as brothers. The audience rose slowly. No applause, not yet. It wasn't time, it was sacred. Then Steve turned to the crowd. His voice trembled, but his spirit shone. I've been through a lot on this stage, but this is the greatest gift I've ever been given. He closed his eyes for a second, then raised his head, and with a breath full of faith, he said, let's pray. That night in a studio in front of millions, two broken men had become instruments of healing. And for a moment, the world believed again.